The letter hit the kitchen table like a verdict. Helen Garner stood with her back straight, her jaw tight, her dark eyes scanning the words her father had written from his sickbed in Laramie, words that stripped her future down to its bones and left it raw and exposed on that worn pine table. The morning light of early April 1882 cut through the single window of the small boarding house room, and every word her father had written felt like a brand pressed against her skin. The deed transfers to Caldwell if the mortgage is not satisfied by October 1st. I am sorry, Helen, I tried. She read those last 3 words 3 times. I tried. Her father, Elias Garner, had spent 22 years building the Garner Ranch on the Wyoming flatlands south of Cheyenne. And in those 3 small words, she could hear every one of those years collapsing like a fence post rotted through at the base. The ranch was 460 acres of mixed grassland and creek bottom, a herd of just under 300 cattle, 2 working horses, a barn that needed a new roof, and a farmhouse that still smelled like her mother's bread, even though Margaret Garner had been gone for 7 years. And now all of it was 6 months from belonging to a man named Silas Caldwell, who had loaned her father money at terms that were nothing short of a trap. A slow, deliberate financial trap set by a man who had wanted that land since before Helen was born. She folded the letter. She pressed it against her chest. She forced herself to breathe. That was the moment Frank Malone knocked on the door. She had never met him. Her father had written about him once, briefly. A hired man I trust, knows cattle, knows the land. She had pictured someone older, someone worn out, someone who would look at her with the practiced pity of a man who has watched too many hard things happen to good people. The man who stood in the doorway of that boarding house on First Street in Laramie, Wyoming, on the 4th day of April 1882, was none of those things. Frank Malone was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, lean through the hips, with dark auburn hair that had been cut recently but not carefully, and green eyes that held the particular quality of someone who had learned to see clearly by surviving the consequences of not seeing clearly soon enough. There was a scar along his left jaw that ran from ear to chin, thin and silver, and his hands were already rough with the kind of work that does not pause for weather or grief. He looked at her standing there with the letter pressed to her chest and the morning light making her grief visible, and he did not flinch and he did not look away. "Miss Garner," he said, "I'm Frank Malone. Your father sent me word 6 days ago. I came as fast as I could." Helen lowered the letter. She looked at him for 3 full seconds, measuring, calculating, already thinking about what she would need him to do and whether he could actually do it. "Come in," she said. "We need to talk about a very specific problem, and I need to know exactly how honest you are before I tell you all of it." He came in. He sat across the table. He folded his hands and he waited, and Helen Garner, who had learned to read people the way her father had taught her to read, whether fast, accurate, and without the luxury of being wrong, decided in those first 3 minutes that Frank Malone was the most honest man she had looked directly at in a very long time, which was precisely what frightened her, because honest men could still fail. Honest men could still let the land slip away. Honest men could still look at a woman and see her future as a secondary concern to their own pride. She had seen it happen. She had watched her father's honest, hard-working friends shake their heads at his mortgage and say they were sorry and ride away with their own herds intact and their own futures undisturbed. She needed more than honesty. She needed capability, strategy, endurance, and something she could only describe as a particular kind of relentless will, the type that does not negotiate with despair. As she began to explain the situation, laying out Caldwell's mortgage terms and the outstanding balance and the brutal October 1st deadline, she watched Frank's face the way she might watch a river gauge during spring runoff, looking for the point at which the pressure became too much, looking for the moment he would glance away and begin making the calculations a man makes when he is deciding whether a fight is worth his effort. He never made those calculations. He leaned forward slightly and he listened, and when she finished he was quiet for only a moment before he said, "Tell me about the herd. Tell me about the land. Tell me what your father had planned for this season before he got sick." That was how it began, not with a declaration or a promise, not with the kind of theatrical courage that men perform for women they are trying to impress. It began with a question about cattle and a season that was already burning down like a short candle. And it began with Frank Malone looking at the problem the way a man looks at something he has already decided he will solve. They left Laramie together 2 days later, riding south toward the Garner Ranch with the April wind, still carrying the last cold bite of a Wyoming winter, and the sky above the plains so wide and blue it seemed impossible that anything could go wrong beneath it. The ranch came into view just before noon on the second day, and Helen felt the weight of it settle over her like a familiar coat, heavy, necessary, a thing that had shaped the way she moved through the world. The farmhouse was square and weathered, white paint peeling from the south-facing boards, the porch railing on the east side, leaning at an angle that her father had been meaning to fix for 3 years. The barn stood further back, its new hay smell already mixing with the older smell of horses and manure and decades of use. The cattle were in the south pasture, visible as a dark mass beyond the second fence line, and the creek that ran along the eastern boundary was running high and clean with snowmelt. Frank stood in the yard and turned slowly, taking it all in with the quiet, systematic attention of a man building a map inside his mind. 460 acres, Helen said. 212 in usable pasture. The rest is rocky draw and creek bottom, but there's good water in it. What's the debt? Frank asked. $1,800 by October 1st. My father paid down $400 last fall before he fell ill. Frank turned toward her. And the herd, 286 head at last count, mostly mixed longhorn and shorthorn cross, about 40 calves born already this spring, another 60 or 70 still coming. Trail sale in Cheyenne, August, possibly September if we push the timeline. He nodded. He was doing the math. She could see it, the way he was calculating weights and trail costs and market prices in his head, working the numbers the way a riverboat gambler works cards, looking for the combination that pays out. "It's tight," he said. "Everything about this is tight," she replied. He looked at her then directly, fully, without the performance of reassurance, and said, "Then we start today." They did. The first week was purely operational. Frank assessed every aspect of the ranch with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the hidden weaknesses were always the ones that killed you. He checked fence lines on horseback, riding the perimeter of each pasture and marking where posts were loose or wire, was rusted or gates had been jury-rigged in ways that held for now, but would not hold under pressure. He inspected the water trough system, the hay stores in the barn, the condition of the cattle themselves, checking hooves, eyes, the condition of their coats, the way they moved. Helen rode with him most days. She had grown up on this land, and she was not about to be a passive observer in the fight to save it. She had been managing the ranch largely on her own since her father's health had declined in October, hiring day labor when she could afford it, doing the work herself when she could not. She knew every fence line, every boggy low spot, every bull's temperament, every cow's particular history. What she had lacked was someone to help her see the whole picture at once, to stand back far enough from the daily urgency of survival to look at the ranch as a system, to ask the questions that required a certain cold-blooded clarity she found difficult when the land was her history and her grief and her identity all wound together. Frank had that clarity. It was not indifference. She could see very quickly that it was not indifference. He cared about the work with a particular intensity that surprised her. But he had not grown up on this land, which meant he could assess it the way a surgeon assesses a wound, without flinching, without romanticizing, without letting love make him choose hope over accuracy. By the end of the first week, he had a list of what needed doing, ranked by urgency and cost. He laid it out on the kitchen table one evening while Helen poured coffee from the enameled pot and the last daylight faded from the window. The north fence needs rebuilding, not just patching. 3 posts are rotted through, and the wire's been spliced so many times in that section, it won't hold a nervous heifer, let alone a spooked bull. The creek crossing on the east boundary needs a proper crossing built before the water drops and we start moving cattle through there regularly. And about 30 head in the south herd have pink eye starting. We need to deal with that now before it spreads. Helen sat down. She looked at his list. The crossing alone will cost us. Lumber and 2 days of hard work, he said. I can build it. What's the nearest mill? Whitmore's 12 miles east. I'll go tomorrow. She looked up from the list. You'll need cash for the lumber. I have some, he said simply. We can settle it when the herd sells. Something shifted in her chest, a small, involuntary shift, like a stone rolling slightly out of the position it had occupied for a very long time. She had expected him to wait for her to fund every step. She had expected him to treat his labor as his sole contribution and leave the financial risk entirely on her shoulders. The casual way he offered to front the cost of lumber was not a grand gesture. It was a practical one, and that somehow made it larger. That's not necessary, she said. It's practical, he replied. She did not argue, because he was right and she was not in a position to let pride cost her time. Over the following weeks, the rhythm of the ranch absorbed them both completely, and Helen began to understand something she had not fully articulated to herself before, that she was not merely watching Frank work, she was working alongside him, genuinely alongside him, in a way she had never worked alongside another person since her father's health had failed. He was up before dawn every day. Not dramatically, not with any performance of dedication. He simply rose because there was work to do, and he was the kind of man who found the gap between deciding to do something and doing it to be very thin. He built the creek crossing in 2 days, working in the cold water with his sleeves rolled and his jaw set. And when it was done, it was solid and level and broad enough for cattle to cross 3 abreast without jostling. He treated the pink eye in the south herd with copper sulfate solution, catching each affected animal with a skill and patience that told Helen he had done this kind of work before, that his hands knew cattle the way hands know any tool used daily for a long time. Within 10 days, the infection was controlled and the spread had stopped. He hired 2-day laborers from the nearest settlement, Amos Webb, a quiet Arapaho man who knew horses better than anyone Helen had ever seen, and Cal Derry, a 20-year-old with more energy than experience but a willingness to learn that made him useful. Frank managed them fairly and firmly, without the kind of small cruelties that some ranch foremen used as a substitute for actual authority. Helen noticed. She noticed everything. She noticed the way he thanked Amos Webb for the specific skill of reading a horse's mood before the horse had shown any external sign of it. She noticed the way he explained to Cal why a fence post needed to be set at a specific depth rather than just telling him to dig deeper. She noticed the way he looked at the land, not as property, not as a problem to be managed, but with something she could only call respect, the kind that you give to something larger and older and more enduring than yourself. By the end of April, the north fence was rebuilt. By mid-May, the calving season had produced an additional 73 calves, higher than expected, and Frank had implemented a system of rotating pastures that was already showing results in the cattle's condition. They were gaining weight ahead of schedule, the kind of weight that translated directly to money at the sale. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, entirely without ceremony or announcement, Helen Garner began to feel something she had not planned to feel, had not allocated any room for in the strict economy of her current life, and found profoundly inconvenient. She noticed his hands. She noticed the way he moved through the barn in the half-dark, confident and sure, never stumbling, knowing where everything was after a single week of learning the layout. She noticed the quality of his silences. He was not a man who talked to fill space, and the silences between them during long afternoon rides along the pasture edges were not uncomfortable, but rather companionable in a way she had to deliberately keep herself from savoring too much. She noticed that when she made a decision he disagreed with, he said so directly and gave his reasoning. And then when she held to her decision, he implemented it fully without the passive resistance of a man nursing a bruised opinion. She noticed that he had a dry, unexpected sense of humor that surfaced in small moments. A comment about a particularly stubborn bull's personal philosophy. A quiet observation about the way spring clouds in Wyoming seemed to be in a perpetual argument with the horizon. She noticed all of it and she cataloged it carefully, and she tried very hard to keep it in a compartment clearly labeled, "Observations about a reliable employee," rather than the compartment it kept trying to migrate toward, which was labeled something else entirely and which she did not have time for, could not afford, and refused to examine directly. But the heart has a particular indifference to scheduling. The crisis that forced everything into the open came in the first week of June, when Silas Caldwell rode onto the Garner ranch for the first time. Helen had been expecting him, not specifically on that Tuesday morning, but in the general sense that a person expects a predator to circle back when it thinks the moment is right. Caldwell was 53 years old, heavyset, with the smooth hands of a man who had spent the last 20 years letting other people do the physical work, while he managed the financial machinery that made him powerful. He had a lawyer's instinct for leverage and a gambler's instinct for the moment when pressure should be applied, and he had clearly looked at the calendar and decided that June was the right time to remind Helen Garner that she was losing. He rode in with two men foremen, or whatever he chose to call them, large and watchful in the way of men hired specifically to create the background awareness of potential force. Frank was in the yard when Caldwell arrived. He had been working on a harness repair, and he stood up slowly when the three horses came through the gate, setting down the leather with the deliberate calm of someone arranging themselves for something unpleasant. Caldwell barely looked at him. He looked for Helen. She was on the porch. "Miss Garner," Caldwell said, pulling up his horse, "you're looking well. Ranch looks a little better than I expected, I'll admit." "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "you made no appointment." "Creditors don't make appointments," he said pleasantly. "I wanted to see how things stood. Given your father's condition and the timeline, I wanted to make sure we were all clear on the terms." "The terms are what they have always been," Helen said. "October 1st, the mortgage satisfied in full." Caldwell smiled. It was the smile of a man who has been patient for a long time and is beginning to enjoy the fact that his patience is about to pay out. "That's the thing, Miss Garner. I've been looking at the numbers. Your father missed the quarterly interest payment in January. Under the terms of the original agreement, missed interest payments accelerate the debt. The full amount is now due July 15th, not October 1st. The silence that followed that announcement was absolute. Helen felt it move through her like cold water, the secret he had been keeping, the trap within the trap, the clause buried in the loan document that her father had either not understood fully or had hoped would never need to be invoked. July 15th. That was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks, not 6 months. She kept her face still. She had learned from her father that showing a predator your wound was the fastest way to ensure it would press on that exact spot forever after. "I'll want to review the document," she said. "Of course," Caldwell said. "My lawyer will send a copy this week." He looked around the yard with the leisurely satisfaction of a man who is already measuring the walls for his own furniture. "It's a fine piece of land. I've always thought so. I'd hate to see it go through a legal proceeding. That's hard on everyone. If you want to discuss a voluntary transfer on terms that would leave you and your father with something to live on, I'm a reasonable man." "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," Helen said. He held her gaze for a moment, testing, measuring, and then he tipped his hat and turned his horse and rode out. Helen waited until the gate had closed behind them before she allowed herself to sit down on the porch step, not because her legs had gone weak exactly, but because the effort of standing perfectly still under that assault had used something up, and she needed to let it replenish. Frank was beside her before she had fully sat down. Not touching, not performing comfort, just there, close enough that she could hear him breathing, close enough that the solidity of him was a physical fact she could orient herself against. "July 15th, she said. "I heard." "That's 6 weeks, Frank." "I know." She looked up at him. The afternoon sun was behind him and she had to shade her eyes to see his face. "Tell me what you're thinking." He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, but assembling, the way a careful man assembles facts before he commits them to speech. "I'm thinking Caldwell is probably right about the clause. Your father's lawyers were likely not as sophisticated as Caldwell's. I'm thinking we can't make the full debt from a trail sale by July 15th. The cattle won't be ready and the timing is wrong. I'm thinking we need to look at every option we have, including some we haven't considered yet." "What options?" "Who owns the land east of the creek boundary?" Helen blinked at the shift. "Amos Webb's family, a small section, about 30 acres of hay meadow. Webb mentioned that section to me last week. Said his family's been trying to sell it for 2 seasons. They need cash. That hay meadow is the best grazing land adjacent to your south pasture. If we lease it for the summer, we can move more cattle to wait faster. Leasing land costs money. Not if the arrangement is right. Amos might take deferred payment cash after the sale." Helen looked at him. "You've already been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about everything," he said quietly. "Every option, every angle. I've been thinking about it since the day we got here." She stood up. She was a tall woman, nearly his height, and when she stood she was close to him, close enough to see the particular green of his eyes in the afternoon light, close enough to notice the way his jaw tightened slightly, not with tension, but with something more careful than that, something more controlled. "Why?" she asked. It came out more directly than she had planned. "Why are you doing this? You had no obligation past your word to my father. This debt isn't yours." "Caldwell moving the deadline up to July 15th. That changes everything you signed on for. Any reasonable man would call it beyond the scope of what was agreed and walk away." Frank looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the yard, lifting a little dust from the dry patches near the gate, and somewhere out in the pasture a cow called to her calf. "I'm not looking for a way out," he said. "I'm looking for a way through." She wanted to ask him why again. She wanted to push past the answer into whatever was underneath it, because she had learned that the first answer a careful man gives is usually the true one but never the complete one, and she wanted the complete one. But she also recognized that pushing too hard in this moment would be asking for something neither of them was ready to handle yet, and the deadline was 6 weeks away, and there was too much work to do. So she nodded. She said, "Talk to Amos tomorrow." He did. Amos Webb agreed to a deferred lease arrangement, not purely for the cash, Helen suspected, but partly because Amos had watched Frank Malone work for 6 weeks and had decided he was the kind of man worth helping, which was itself a significant endorsement from someone whose judgment Helen trusted implicitly. The lease gave them access to 30 acres of prime grazing, and Frank immediately began rotating the heaviest cattle through it, pushing them toward the kind of weight that would make a July sale viable. He also did something Helen had not expected. He rode to Cheyenne. He was gone for 3 days, and Helen did not ask him where he was going before he left, because she trusted his judgment, and also because she was engaged in the daily work of the ranch, and could not afford the distraction of wondering too hard about a man who had been occupying too much of her mental landscape already. When he came back, he had 2 things: a letter of introduction from a cattle buyer named Marsh Whitfield who operated out of Denver, and information about a different kind of sale. Whitfield, Frank explained, was putting together a private purchase of prime Wyoming cattle for a Colorado beef consortium that was building supply for the Denver market. The purchase was happening in late June, not August, and the price per head was higher than the Cheyenne Trail sale by nearly $3, not because Whitfield was generous, but because he needed high-quality cattle on a specific timeline and was paying for the certainty. The catch, Helen asked. Minimum of 200 head, all of them prime condition, delivered to a loading point near Pueblo Junction by June 28th. That's 2 weeks from now. 16 days. Helen did the math in her head, the way she had been doing math in her head since April, constantly, compulsively, the arithmetic of survival. 200 head at the current rate plus the premium would come very close to the full debt amount. Not over it, but close. Possibly close enough if they combined it with what she had in the bank from last fall's sale. What's the condition of the top 200, she asked. Better than I expected. The pasture rotation worked. Whitfield sent a man with me on the way back. He came out, looked at the herd yesterday morning while you were at the creek fence. He said he'd take them. Helen put her hands flat on the kitchen table. She pressed her palms against the worn pine and she breathed. You brought a buyer out here while I was working, without telling me first. If I had told you first, you would have spent 3 days worrying about whether the cattle were ready and second-guessing whether to take the meeting, and we would have lost time we don't have. She looked at him. She was not angry. She was something more complicated than angry, something that involved the uncomfortable recognition that he had been right, that she would have done exactly what he described, and that his having known that meant he understood how her mind worked better than she had quite realized. Don't do that again, she said. I won't, he said. Not a defensive promise, a simple acknowledgement. How much does Whitfield's price put us against the full debt? Frank pulled a paper from his shirt pocket and laid it on the table. He had written out the numbers in a clear, even hand. She studied them. 200 head at the Whitfield premium plus her bank balance came to $1,640. The debt as of July 15th, including the accelerated interest, was $1,822, $182 short. She stared at the number. $182 might as well have been 1,000, because they had no other source and 12 days left before the cattle needed to leave for Pueblo Junction. Frank reached into his inside coat pocket. He placed on the table a bank draft. She looked at it. $200 drawn on an account at the Laramie First Bank in Frank Malone's name. No, she said immediately. Helen, absolutely not. She pushed the draft back toward him. I will not take your personal savings. I will not let you put your own money into this. It's what I have, he said quietly. I've been saving for 3 years. I was going to use it to buy into a small operation of my own eventually. But this is more immediate, and if the sale goes through, you can pay me back after the debt is settled. She stood up from the table. She walked to the window. She stood looking out at the yard, at the late evening light on the barn, at the particular golden quality that Wyoming light takes on in early June when the air is still dry and the days are long. Why would you do this? She asked. Her voice was quieter now, the confrontational edge gone, replaced by something more genuinely bewildered. Your savings, Frank, 3 years of saving. She heard him stand. She heard his boots on the wooden floor. He stopped a few feet behind her. Because I have been here for 2 months, he said, and in those 2 months I have watched you fight for this land with everything you have. I have watched you wake up before dawn and work until dark and carry the weight of your father's debt and your mother's memory and 22 years of someone else's hard work, and I have never once heard you ask for anything you didn't think you could give back. And I would rather give my savings to something real and worth saving than keep it in a bank against a future that might be smaller than the one I could help build right now. She turned around. He was 3 feet away. The evening light came through the window past her and fell across his face, and she could see everything in it. The honesty she had recognized from the first day, yes, but also something else. Something she had been watching grow in him for 2 months, or perhaps had been watching grow in herself in response to him, the distinction being one she was no longer entirely clear on. Frank, she said. You don't have to say anything, he said. Take the draft. Save the ranch. Let's get the cattle to Pueblo Junction. She took the draft. She folded it carefully. She looked at him for one more moment, weighing, measuring, reading, in the way she had always read people and the way she had learned to read him specifically, which was with a particular attentiveness she had not given to anyone else in a very long time. Thank you, she said. 2 words, simply spoken, loaded with everything she was not saying yet. The cattle drive to Pueblo Junction took 4 days. Frank, Helen, Amos Webb, and Cal Derry pushed 212 head south and east through the Wyoming grasslands in the longest, hardest-working stretch of Helen's life, which was saying something given the season that had preceded it. They rode from before dawn to dusk, navigating creek crossings and nervous cattle, and one night of rain that turned the ground soft and made the herd want to scatter in 4 directions simultaneously. Frank was everywhere. He rode point and swing and drag as needed, reading the herd's mood with an accuracy that Helen found genuinely impressive, knowing when to push and when to let them settle, knowing when a particular animal was about to make a decision that would cost them time, and getting in front of it before it happened. On the second night, camped on the south bank of a shallow river crossing with the cattle settled in Amos, and Cal asleep near the fire, Helen and Frank sat up late with coffee growing cold in their hands, and talked in the way that people talk when they are tired enough to have dropped most of their defenses. He told her about his dark past, about growing up in Missouri, about a father who had run cattle badly and owed debts that had eventually consumed everything, about watching his family's land sold at auction when he was 17, about the particular quality of helplessness a boy feels when the thing he has grown up believing was permanent turns out to be contingent. "That's why you understand what's at stake here," Helen said. "Yes," he said, "but it's more than that now." She looked at him across the low fire. The cattle were quiet. The night was clear and cold and enormous overhead, the way Wyoming nights always were, as if the sky was a separate country that operated by different rules. "What do you mean?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, and she recognized the particular quality of his silence, the kind where he was being careful, not because he was unsure of what he felt, but because he was choosing the right words for it. "I mean that when I rode in April, this was a job," he said. "Job I cared about doing well because I always care about doing things well. But somewhere between the north fence and the creek crossing, and 6 weeks of riding these pastures every day, somewhere in all of that, it stopped being a job." "Frank, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I know what the timing is. I know we're in the middle of a cattle drive trying to save your family's land, and this is the worst possible moment for any conversation beyond that. I just wanted you to know." Helen looked at him for a long time. The fire crackled between them. One of the cattle near the edge of the camp shifted and settled. "It's not the worst possible moment," she said quietly. "It might actually be exactly the right moment." He looked up at her. "I have been telling myself for 2 months that what I was feeling was gratitude," she said. "Respect, professional regard, appropriate appreciation for a competent man doing necessary work." A small, careful smile crossed his face. And none of those words are what it actually is," she said. "And I think I have been sufficiently dishonest with myself about it for long enough." The fire shifted between them, sending a brief bright flare into the dark, and Frank Malone looked at Helen Garner across it with the expression of a man who has been carrying something carefully for a long time and has just been told it is safe to set it down. "We should sleep," she said. "Early start." "We should," he agreed. They did not sleep particularly quickly. Marsh Whitfield met them at Pueblo Junction on the morning of June 27th, 1 day ahead of schedule. He was a brisk, businesslike man with a gray mustache and a precise eye for cattle, and he walked the herd with a thoroughness that would have been nerve-wracking if the condition of the animals had not been so demonstrably good. Frank had pushed them well but not hard, and they arrived in better shape than could have been reasonably expected given the distance and timeline. Whitfield paid on delivery. Bank draft, drawn on the Denver Commercial Bank, for the full agreed amount. Helen held it in both hands and felt the entire architecture of the last 3 months pressing against the inside of her chest. Every fence post, every early morning, every worried calculation, every conversation at the kitchen table, every silent ride along the pasture edge at dusk. She looked at Frank. He was watching her, not the draft. They rode back to Laramie in 5 days. Helen went directly to the bank. She deposited the Whitfield draft, combined it with her existing balance, and added Frank's personal draft, which she had carried folded against her chest the entire journey, to the total. She then drew a cashier's check made out to the Laramie County Mortgage and Trust in the amount of $1,822, walked 2 blocks to the courthouse, and filed satisfaction of the Garner Ranch mortgage before Silas Caldwell's lawyer could process any further paperwork. The clerk who handled the filing was a small, precise man named Hutchins who stamped the document 3 times with the particular enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed the moment when the law closed against a man like Caldwell rather than for him. "Filed and recorded," Hutchins said. "Garner Ranch is clear of debt as of today, July 2nd, 1882. Congratulations, Miss Garner." She thanked him. She walked out into the afternoon sunshine on First Street in Laramie, Wyoming, where this entire season had started in April with a letter and a knock on a boarding house door, and she stood on the boardwalk and breathed. Frank was leaning against the post outside the land office, waiting. She walked to him. She held up the stamped copy of the satisfaction document. He looked at it, read it, and something crossed his face that she had not seen there before. Something that was not the controlled, careful competence he wore like a second skin, but underneath that, something more open and more private. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he confirmed. Folded the document carefully and placed it in her bag. She looked at him. "I owe you $200, she said. "You don't?" "I do, and I will pay it back. That is not negotiable." She paused. "But first I need to say something else." He waited. "I need to know what you plan to do now," she said. "The season was the agreement. The debt is settled. You could ride anywhere from here. You could take your $200 and go find that small operation you mentioned, the one you were saving toward." "I could," he said. "Is that what you want?" He looked at her steadily. The afternoon light on First Street in Laramie made everything very clear. The dust, the wooden storefronts, the distant line of mountains to the west, and Frank Malone's face, which was entirely open to her reading in this moment, carrying no more careful concealment, no more managed presentation of competence over emotion. "The operation I want is 460 acres south of Cheyenne," he said. "I have wanted it since about the 3rd week of April, and I have been trying very hard not to say so until the timing was right." Helen Garner looked at the man who had spent 122 days rebuilding her fences, rotating her pastures, treating her cattle, fronting his life savings, pushing 200 head to Colorado ahead of schedule, and who had done all of it with a steadiness and an honesty and a particular quality of quiet devotion that she had been cataloging with enormous care since the day he had arrived. "The timing," she said, "is right." She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers warm, rough shore, and in the middle of First Street in Laramie, Wyoming, on the 2nd day of July, 1882, that was enough. That was entirely enough. They rode back to the ranch together that afternoon, arriving as the sun was going down behind the mountains to the west, and the flat Wyoming sky was turning the particular shades of orange and rose that made the grassland look like something from a painting. The cattle were in the south pasture. The barn was solid. The creek was running clear along the eastern boundary. Amos Webb was in the yard when they arrived, tending to the horses, and he looked at them riding in together in the late light, and he made no comment, but the quality of his silence was warm and knowing in the way of a man who has been observing something develop for several months and has simply been waiting for the relevant parties to catch up. Helen made supper while Frank took care of the horses, and they ate together at the kitchen table with the window open to the evening air, and the conversation was easy and warm, and full of the particular domestic comfort of 2 people who have survived something hard together, and are beginning to understand what the other side of it looks like. After supper, Frank sat across from her with his coffee and said, "I need to tell you something I should have said earlier in the season." She looked up. "When I first came to this ranch," he said, "it was because your father asked me and because I needed the work. But your father told me something else in his letter. He said you were the best thing he had ever built, and that the ranch was the second best, and that if I helped save the second best I would understand why the first best was worth knowing." Helen was quiet for a moment. The evening insects had started outside, the small sounds of a Wyoming summer night beginning to assemble themselves. "He wrote that?" she asked. "He did." Frank's voice was careful, respectful of the weight of it. "He also said you would not accept help easily. He said you were the most capable person he had raised and the most stubbornly independent, and that the best thing he could do from his sickbed was send someone capable enough that you couldn't dismiss the help and stubborn enough that you couldn't outlast it." She laughed, a real laugh, sudden and bright, the kind she had not given to anything in quite a long time. He knew exactly what he was doing. "Your father is a clever man," Frank said. "Yes," she said softly, "he is." She would go to Laramie the following week to see him, to bring him the satisfaction document in person, to sit beside his bed and tell him that his land was safe, and his daughter was more than fine. But that was a week away, and tonight the ranch was clean and whole, and the debt was paid, and the man sitting across the kitchen table from her was looking at her with an expression that made the whole long, hard season worth every day of it. 2 weeks later, Frank Malone rode to Laramie and spoke to Helen Garner. He went alone. He did not tell Helen he was going, not out of any secretiveness, but because it was something he needed to do man to man, the old way, the right way, without Helen present to manage either of them. Elias was recovering slowly from his illness, sitting up in his boarding house bed with a book he wasn't reading when Frank knocked on the open door. The conversation lasted an hour. Frank had prepared what he would say, but Helen Garner asked better questions than Frank had prepared for about his character, his history, his financial situation, his plans, his understanding of Helen's stubbornness and capability, and the specific quality of care she required, which was not the kind that diminished her but the kind that stood beside her. Frank answered every question honestly, including the ones that required him to acknowledge his dark past, the failed family ranch, the years of drifting before he had found steady purpose, the mistakes he had made in his 20s that he was not proud of, but that had ultimately shaped the man he had become. Elias listened to all of it with the same still, measuring attention that Frank had first seen in Helen and now recognized as a family trait, a particular quality of discernment refined by decades of reading land and weather and people. When Frank was finished, Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "She'll argue with you constantly." "I know," Frank said. "She's usually right," Elias said. "I know that too," Frank said. "I've had 5 months of evidence." Elias smiled. It was the smile of a man who has been worried about his daughter for a long time and has just been given reason to worry less. "Take care of my ranch," he said, "and take better care of her." "Those are exactly the right priorities," Frank said, "in exactly the right order." Frank asked Helen to marry him on the ranch itself, in the south pasture on a Sunday evening in late July when the light was long and gold and the cattle were settled at the far end of the grass and the creek was audible in the background. He did not make a speech. He was not a man given to speeches. He simply stopped his horse beside hers and turned to face her and said, "Helen, marry me. I want to spend the rest of my life on this land and beside you, and I don't want to spend another unnecessary day doing one without the other." She looked at him. She was not a woman given to easy tears, but her eyes were bright with something that was not entirely the reflection of the late sun. "That is the most efficiently worded proposal I have ever heard," she said. "It's honest," he said, "which I have always thought was better than ornate." "Yes," she said. "Yes to the proposal being honest," or "Yes to marrying you, Frank, obviously yes." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and she let him take it, and they sat like that in the south pasture of the Garner ranch in the last light of a Wyoming summer evening, holding on. They were married in September, before the summer fully ended, in the small Presbyterian church in Cheyenne that Helen had attended with her parents as a child. Elias Garner was well enough to travel by then, not fully recovered, still thin and careful in his movements, but upright and present and dressed in his good coat, which was all that mattered. Amos Webb attended. Cal Derry attended. A handful of neighbors attended. The ceremony was simple and direct, which suited both of them. The minister, a broad man named Reverend Coates who had been conducting frontier weddings for 20 years, had seen enough of them to know when the people standing before him were serious about what they were promising, and he looked between Frank Malone and Helen Garner and registered without doubt that these were two people who understood exactly what they were signing up for. When he asked Frank if he took Helen as his wife, Frank said, "I do," with the same steady directness he brought to everything he said, and Helen, who was watching his face when he said it, felt something in her chest that she had no adequate word for settle permanently into the place it was always supposed to occupy. When he asked Helen if she took Frank as her husband, she said, "I do," quietly and clearly, and with the private acknowledgement, kept entirely to herself, that she had been moving toward this answer since approximately the 3rd week of April. They returned to the ranch as Mr. and Mrs. Malone, and the ranch that had begun the year as a crisis became something else, became home in a way that it had always been for Helen, but was now for the first time for Frank, properly and completely, and without qualification. Elias Garner stayed through October, sleeping in the small guest room and watching his daughter and his new son-in-law work the ranch through the fall roundup season with the satisfied attention of a man whose best piece of work has turned out well. In November, well enough to travel, he went back to Laramie to his boarding house and his doctor and his slow recovery, carrying with him the signed deed to the ranch, transferred officially to Helen and Frank Malone jointly, an act that had required some maneuvering given the legal structures of 1882 Wyoming, but that Frank had pursued with his characteristic relentlessness until the paperwork was exactly what it needed to be. The autumn and winter of 1882 settled over the Garner-Malone ranch with a quiet that felt like reward. The barn got its new roof in October, the project Frank had identified in his first week assessment and had been promising himself all season. He and Cal Derry worked it together over 4 days in a stretch of warm, dry weather, and when it was done, Helen stood in the yard and looked at it and said, "My father has been meaning to do that for 4 years. Now it's done," Frank said. "Now it's done," she agreed, and reached up to brush a wood shaving from his shoulder. They spent their evenings at the kitchen table, the same table where the letter had arrived in April, the same table where Frank had laid out his numbered lists of work priorities and his carefully drawn mathematics of debt and survival. Now those evenings were different in their content but recognizable in their quality. Two serious, capable people thinking through problems together, sharing the work of a shared life. Helen corresponded regularly with her father, whose health was improving steadily through the winter, and she wrote to him with the detailed, affectionate frankness that their relationship had always permitted, telling him about the ranch and about Frank and about the life they were building on the land he had spent 22 years shaping. Elias wrote back with equal frankness. He was proud. He said so clearly, without the bashfulness some men of his generation applied to emotional statements. He was proud of what Helen had done and what Frank was doing, and what the two of them were making together out of the most frightening year of her life. Silas Caldwell never came back. Helen heard through the Cheyenne Gossip Network, which was efficient and accurate in the way that small community information networks always are, that Caldwell had made a bad land investment in Nebraska that had significantly reduced his appetite for further acquisitions. She felt no particular triumph about this, only the clean absence of an ongoing threat, which was its own kind of relief. In the spring of 1883, Helen told Frank she was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table, directly, in the same manner she brought every significant piece of information, clearly, with the facts presented first and the emotional content apparent but not dramatized. Frank put down his coffee cup. He looked at her. He was quiet for a long moment in that way that meant he was not uncertain about his reaction but was ensuring he expressed it accurately. Then he smiled fully, openly, the kind of smile she had learned to look for because he did not deploy it carelessly, and when it appeared it meant something real. He reached across the table and took both her hands and said, "Tell me what you need." She laughed. "I just told you what I need. I need you to know." "I know," he said. "I mean going forward, tell me what you need." "I need you to keep doing exactly what you have been doing," she said. "And I need you to not treat me like I'm fragile because I'm not." "I know you're not fragile," he said. "I have substantial evidence on that point." "Good," she said. "Then we're agreed." He squeezed her hands. He looked at her across the kitchen table, with the April light. It was April again. A full year since he had knocked on that boarding house door in Laramie, coming through the window, and the particular expression on his face was one she had memorized without meaning to, and would never stop finding exactly what she needed to see. "I'm going to be a good father," he said. Not as a promise made to reassure her, but as a statement of intention made to himself, the way he stated all his intentions as fixed things, already decided, already underway. "I know you are," she said. Elias Garner traveled south to the ranch in July to help. He was largely recovered by then, thinner than he had been but genuinely himself again, with the energy and the watchful intelligence that Helen had inherited from him, and that she saw now, looking between him and Frank, had found its complement rather than its competition in her husband. The baby arrived in November of 1883, a boy, delivered by the midwife who traveled from Cheyenne. Frank was in the house throughout, doing what Frank always did in a crisis, making himself useful without making himself the center of the situation, ensuring that everything that could be managed was managed, and being present in the still, steady way that Helen had come to rely on as one of the fundamental comforts of her life. They named him Elias James Malone. James for Frank's father, who had failed at everything he attempted but had, in the process, taught Frank everything he knew about what not to do, which Frank considered a genuine inheritance, of the specific kind that costs the giver enormously and the receiver nothing, and that was therefore worth honoring. Elias Garner held his grandson with the careful, delighted attention of a man, holding something he had not been entirely certain he would live to hold, and he looked at Helen and Frank over the top of the baby's dark head and said, very simply, "Good." It was, in Elias Garner's vocabulary, the highest possible praise. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was the hardest winter Wyoming had seen in a decade. The first snow came in October, weeks early, and it did not stop with any seriousness until February. The temperatures dropped to levels that killed cattle in their pastures if they were not managed correctly, and the entire territory was engaged in the grim, relentless work of keeping herds alive until spring. Frank had prepared for a hard winter. He had begun preparing in September, building hay stores beyond what a normal winter would require, reinforcing the barn's south wall against wind, creating a system for checking on the cattle in rotating shifts through the worst cold. When the extreme cold came, the preparation paid out. They lost 11 head, which was painful but survivable, while ranches that had been less thorough lost 30, 40, 60 animals. Helen worked through that winter with the same physical determination she had shown in every previous season, undeterred by having a nursing infant, managing the work around young Elias with the practical ingenuity that she brought to all logistical challenges. Frank watched her and said nothing about it because she had told him not to treat her like she was fragile, and he had listened. But the quality of his attention to her during those months was particularly careful and particularly devoted, and she knew it and let herself be grateful for it. By March, when the cold finally began to break and the sky showed its first real relenting, the ranch had come through intact. The herd was thinner but healthy. The fence lines had held. The hay stores had been sufficient. Spring came again in that slow, definitive Wyoming way, not gradually, but in a series of decisive days when the temperature climbed and the mud appeared and the creek ran high, and the cattle moved into the returning green with visible relief. Young Elias, 4 months old by the time April arrived, developed the habit of being carried in the crook of his father's arm while Frank made his morning inspection of the south pasture, a habit that both of them seemed to find agreeable, and that Helen documented privately in her memory with the particular warmth of something that would become a core image of this time in her life. Amos Webb came back to work for the spring season, as he had done the previous year. His arrangement with the ranch had evolved from day labor to something more like a permanent part-time partnership. He would spend 6 months of the year working the Malone ranch, and the other 6 managing the Webb family's own small operation, and the leased hay meadow had become a formal shared grazing arrangement that benefited both properties. There was an afternoon in May of 1884 when Helen was standing on the porch of the farmhouse, her father's farmhouse, her house now, hers and Frank's, watching Frank and Amos work a young horse in the yard, and young Elias was on her hip, pulling at her collar with the focused determination of an infant engaged in important research. And the Wyoming sun was exactly the kind that turns everything it touches briefly golden before the afternoon shadows take it back. She thought, standing there, about the letter that had arrived in April 2 years earlier. She thought about the 460 acres and the debt and the October deadline that had been pulled to July by a trap within a trap. She thought about Frank at her boarding house door, the auburn hair, the green eyes, the stillness of a man who had already decided something important. She thought about every day of that season, every fence post and creek crossing, every pre-dawn morning and every late-night arithmetic session, every difficult conversation, and every silence between them that had been warmer than words. Every day of a season that should have broken her, and instead had built something she would not have traded for any version of a life in which none of it had been necessary. Frank looked up from the horse and caught her looking. He held her gaze for a moment across the distance of the yard, and she could see in that look everything she had learned to read in his face. The honesty, the steadiness, the dry private humor, and underneath all of it the particular warmth that was specifically hers, that had been accumulating since April of 1882 and showed no signs of diminishing. She raised a hand. He raised his. Young Elias observed this exchange from his position on her hip and made a sound of profound commentary. "I know," Helen told him quietly. "Believe me, I know." In the summer of 1884, Elias Garner came to live on the ranch permanently. His Laramie doctor agreed that the ranch air was better for him than the boarding house, and the truth was that Elias himself was better on the ranch, more himself, more alert, more at ease. He had spent 22 years building this land, and it suited him in a deep way that the city never had. He and Frank settled into a working relationship that had the quality of 2 engineers who have different specializations and deeply respect each other's expertise, each learning from the other in the way that cross-generational working relationships produce when the pride on both sides is smaller than the curiosity. Elias knew things about this specific land that no amount of general skill could replace. He knew which pastures went wet first in spring, which draws had hidden water in dry years, which neighbors could be trusted absolutely, and which required careful management. Frank brought the systematic approach, the ability to see the whole operation as a set of interdependent systems, the relentless problem-solving capacity that had saved the ranch in its darkest season. Helen, watching the 2 men she loved most in the world sitting together at the kitchen table working through a question about pasture rotation, with the absorbed competence of people who find genuine satisfaction in hard problems, felt something she had no single word for, a fullness, a rightness, a sense of everything having arrived at the configuration it was always moving toward. By the fall of 1884, the Malone Ranch, which the neighbors still called the Garner Ranch, which both Helen and Frank were fine with, Since the name carried history they had no interest in erasing, had expanded its herd to nearly 400 head, and had taken on the eastern section of land that the Webb family had finally decided to sell. The purchase had been Frank's idea and Helen's negotiation, which was the pattern that had developed between them on matters of acquisition. He identified the opportunity, she closed it, and they both lived with the outcome. The expanded land gave them room to develop a breeding program Frank had been thinking about for 2 seasons, introducing shorthorn bulls into the mixed herd to improve the quality and weight of the calves, a practice that was becoming more common in Wyoming as the cattle market matured and buyers became more selective about the beef they were purchasing. It required investment. It required careful management. It required exactly the combination of long-term thinking and day-to-day skill that the two of them together had demonstrated they were capable of. The first season of the breeding program produced results that more than justified the investment. The calves were heavier, more consistent, better conditioned. At the fall sale of 1884, they achieved the highest per-head price the ranch had ever recorded. Frank came home from Cheyenne with the bank draft and the numbers in his careful handwriting, and laid them on the kitchen table the way he had laid out numbers on that same table since their first week together. And this time, the numbers told a story of genuine prosperity rather than desperate survival. Helen looked at them. She looked at him. "We did it," she said. "We did," he agreed. "The ranch is worth more than the debt ever was," she said. "By a significant margin," he confirmed. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Young Elias, now nearly a year old and engaged in the serious project of learning to walk by navigating along the base of the kitchen cabinets, made a triumphant sound at having successfully completed a particularly difficult stretch near the corner. Helen and Frank both looked at him. Then they looked at each other. "He's going to be unstoppable," Frank said. "Obviously," said Helen. "He has decent genetics." Frank laughed, that specific, genuine laugh that she had been collecting since April of 1882, adding each instance to the private library of things about this man that constituted her happiness. In the spring of 1885, Helen told Frank she was pregnant again. This time at the creek, not the kitchen table. They had been walking the eastern boundary on a Sunday morning, the boundary that had been her father's marker for 22 years and was now theirs, and she had told him between one step and the next simply because that was how she did things. He stopped walking. He looked at her. He said, "When?" "October, I think." "The same timing as Elias." "October seems to be our month," she said. He reached out and touched her face, a gesture so different from his usual careful practicality that it caught her breath slightly, the way his rarer physical tenderness always did precisely, because it was not constant but deliberate, chosen, entirely sincere. "Good," he said, exactly as her father had said it, with the same economy of language covering the same depth of feeling. She leaned into him slightly. They stood at the eastern boundary of the Garner Malone ranch in the May morning, with the creek running behind them and the mountains visible to the west and the whole enormous Wyoming sky above them, and she thought about all the ordinary, extraordinary things that constituted her life with this man. The kitchen table conversations, the long pasture rides, the shared silences that were never empty. The way he still looked at her after 3 years with exactly the same quality of attention as the first time she had caught him looking, honest and warm and entirely without apology. The baby born in October 1885 was a girl. They named her Margaret for Helen's mother. Elias Garner cried when he was told the name, quietly and without apology, in the way of men who have lived long enough to know that certain moments earn whatever emotion arrives with them. Margaret Malone arrived in the world with a decisive quality that was apparent almost immediately. She had opinions, expressed them clearly, and expected them to be considered with appropriate seriousness. Frank, watching his daughter navigate her first weeks of existence, said to Helen that he suspected she was going to be very much like her mother, and Helen said she thought that was probably the finest compliment he had ever given her. Cal Derry, who had grown from the 20-year-old with more energy than experience into a genuinely skilled ranch hand over the 3 years he had been working the Malone operation, had by this point taken on supervisory responsibilities that freed Frank to spend more time on the breeding program and the longer-term strategic planning that was increasingly where the ranch's growth came from. Cal had also, in the fall of 1885, married a young woman named Rosie from the settlement east of the ranch, and his general air of contentment with the world had increased substantially. The ranch, as it stood in the late autumn of 1885, was a different thing from what it had been in the spring of 1882. It was not different in its essential nature: still cattle, still grassland, still the daily physical work of maintaining living animals on demanding land. But it had expanded and deepened and settled into itself in the way that things do when they are being genuinely well cared for over years rather than merely kept alive. Helen Garner Malone was 30 years old. She was, in the estimation of everyone who knew her, more herself than she had ever been, harder in some ways and softer in others, the way that serious living tends to work on a person. The anxiety that had driven her through the crisis season of 1882 had not disappeared, but had been refined into something more productive: a watchfulness, a forward planning, a refusal to let complacency take root in a life that had once been nearly lost to inattention. Frank Malone was 34 years old. He was the kind of man who had become more at ease with himself over the years they had been together, not because life had become easier, but because he had found the place where his particular combination of skills and character was precisely what was needed, and the daily confirmation of that fit had given him a settled quality, a groundedness, that suited him in the way that some people are simply better in a permanent location than a transient one. Elias Garner, at 61, was not fully recovered from the illness that had precipitated the crisis of 1882, but was holding steady at a level of health that allowed him genuine pleasure in his daily life. His grandchildren, his land, his evenings with Frank working through the quarterly accounts, his afternoons with Helen riding the pastures the way they had ridden them when she was a child, and he was a man building something from the ground up. On a Sunday evening in November of 1885, when the first hard frost had come, and the ranch was buttoned up for the approaching winter, and both children were asleep and Elias had gone to bed early, and the house was quiet with the particular quality of a home that is both full and at peace, Helen and Frank sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the accounts for the year and the early plans for the spring season. The accounts were, for the first time in the history of the Garner Ranch, genuinely prosperous, not merely surviving, not barely adequate. Genuinely, unmistakably prosperous, with a surplus that exceeded expenses by a margin that made future investment possible without the white-knuckle anxiety of a single failed season destroying everything. Frank laid out the numbers. Helen read them. She was quiet for a moment. "My father is going to cry again," she said. "Probably," Frank agreed. She looked at the numbers. She looked at Frank. She thought about the letter, about the deadline, about the trap within the trap, about the man who had arrived at a boarding house door and looked at the problem she was carrying and said, "Tell me about the herd." 3 years ago this spring," she said, "I was sitting in a boarding house room in Laramie reading a letter that told me everything my father had built was going to be taken by a man who had been engineering the opportunity to take it for 20 years. And I was calculating very precisely how much I was losing and how little time I had and whether there was any possible path through it." Frank was watching her. "And then a man knocked on the door," she said. "And he was nothing like what I had expected. And I told myself very clearly and very specifically that the feeling I had about him was purely professional regard, and that I was simply grateful for a competent ally, and that the personal resonance of it was irrelevant to the immediate problem." Frank was trying, without great success, to keep his expression entirely neutral. "I was wrong about all of that," Helen said. Very specifically and in detail, I was wrong. And I want to say, in case I have not said it clearly enough in the 3 years since, that I am grateful for all of it. For the work and the season and the hard summer and the way you put your personal savings on this kitchen table, because the arithmetic required it. But mostly I am grateful for the knock on the door. I am grateful that you came through the door and sat across the table from me and listened, and that you decided this was worth your whole season and then your whole life. I am grateful every day. Frank looked at her for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen, with the fire going low and the coffee growing cold and the children asleep and the ranch intact and prosperous outside the window. "Helen," he said quietly. "Yes." "I knocked on that door hoping for 3 months' work and a fair wage," he said. "I left with the most important life I could have imagined, and with you in it, I would have knocked on 1,000 doors." She reached across the table. He took her hand. They sat like that in the kitchen of the Garner Malone ranch, with the November wind moving against the new barn roof and the accounts showing prosperity where there had once been desperation. And outside, 400 acres of Wyoming grassland that had been, at various points, a dream, a debt, a crisis, a fight, a proof, and a home. In the years that followed, the Malone ranch grew steadily and well. The breeding program Frank had initiated became the model that several neighboring ranches adopted after seeing the results. Amos Webb's family operation, supported by the long-standing lease arrangement and the consistent work relationship, expanded its own small herd and achieved a stability that Amos said publicly, and frequently he credited in large part to having had the right neighbors at the right time. Cal Dairy eventually became a part owner in a small supplementary grazing operation adjacent to the Malone southern boundary, an arrangement Frank had helped him structure over 2 years of careful planning. Young Elias Malone grew into the particular combination of his parents that made everyone who knew both of them nod with recognition: his mother's directness and his father's patience, Helen's eye for people and Frank's feel for land. He had opinions about cattle before he had the vocabulary to express them precisely, and his father found this, privately, one of the greatest satisfactions of his life. Margaret Malone grew up with her grandfather's name and her mother's character, and a specific brand of cheerful intransigence that caused Frank, on several notable occasions, to look at Helen with an expression that communicated clearly, "You see what you produced," and Helen would look back with an expression that communicated equally clearly, "Yes, and I am entirely unapologetic." Elias Garner lived to be 74 years old. He died on the ranch, in the room that had been built onto the east side of the farmhouse for him in 1886, on a morning in early spring when the Wyoming land was just beginning its annual return to green. He had had time in his last years to see everything he had built survive and surpass itself, to see his daughter and his son-in-law and his grandchildren living fully in the life he had laid the foundation for imperfectly, with the wrong loan terms and a near-fatal moment of near loss, but with the essential rightness of a man who had worked hard on something that was genuinely worth working hard for. He was buried on the ranch, at the eastern boundary, near the creek. Helen stood at his grave in the April light and held Frank's hand, and felt the full weight of the life she was standing inside, the weight of love and loss and endurance, and the particular kind of fortune that is not luck but the long-accumulated result of showing up every day and doing the necessary work with honesty and care. Frank stood beside her, solid and present and entirely himself. "He knew what he was doing," she said. "When he wrote to you, he knew exactly." "He was a very clever man," Frank said. "Yes," she said, "he was." The ranch in the spring of 1891 was 460 acres plus the eastern web section, now purchased outright, giving them a total of just under 500 acres of the best mixed cattle land in that part of Wyoming. The herd stood at 420 head of the improved Shorthorn cross that had become the Malone operation's signature. The farmhouse had been expanded twice, the barn had been rebuilt once, and the fence lines were in better condition than they had been in any year of the ranch's history. Helen was 39 years old. Frank was 40. Their children were 8 and 5, full of the particular loud energy of children who have grown up with land to run on, and animals to understand, and parents who work hard and love each other with visible daily sincerity. On a Sunday morning in May, Helen and Frank rode the eastern boundary together, as they had done, most Sundays, throughout the years of their marriage. It was their version of keeping track, of staying in contact with the land that was the foundation of everything they had built together. They rode slowly, not checking for problems specifically, but simply being present on the land, reading it the way you read something you know very well and never stop learning from. At the creek, Helen stopped her horse. "I want to tell you something," she said. Frank stopped beside her. The creek was running well, the spring melt still in it, clear and cold and purposeful. "When I was sitting in that boarding house room in April of 1882, she said, "I knew the ranch could be saved. I knew it intellectually, I had the arithmetic, I understood what would be needed. But I did not believe at that moment that it could be saved in time. There was a part of me that was already beginning to work through what came after, what it would mean, what I would do." Frank listened. "And then you came," she said. "And that possibility, what came after, the version without the ranch closed, not because of what you promised, not because of anything you said, because of the quality of your attention when you sat down at that table and asked me to tell you about the herd. I knew in that moment that the ranch would survive. I believed it, not just knew it." She looked at him. The creek moved behind them, and the May air was soft, and the mountains to the west were still capped with the last of the season's white, and the sky was exactly the color it always was above Wyoming, which was a specific, irreplaceable blue. "I want you to know that every day since that morning has been built on what that moment started," she said. "The work and the fight and the season and the marriage and the children and all of it, every day. And I would not change a single one of them, not the hard ones, not the ones where everything went wrong at once. Not the winter of '83 when we lost 11 head and I cried for the first and only time in front of you, and you handed me coffee instead of trying to fix the crying, which was exactly the right thing." Frank smiled at that. "Every day of it," she said. "All of it exactly as it was." He reached across the space between their horses, the same way he had reached across that space years before in the south pasture when he had asked her to marry him, and she took his hand, the same way she had taken it then. "Every day of it," he said. They held hands at the creek in the May morning, two people who had earned each other through the particular curriculum of a hard season on hard land, and who had gone on from that season to build something that was, by any meaningful measurement, a good and full and honest life. The ranch spread out behind them, living and breathing and productive, carrying in its fence lines and its water crossings and its breeding program, and its quietly prosperous accounts the evidence of what one season of total commitment can accomplish when the commitment is genuine, and the person you are making it beside is worth every day of the effort. It had been one season. He had used every single day of it. And everything that followed had been built on that foundation, solidly, permanently, for keeps. The creek ran on. The cattle moved in the south pasture. The children's voices carried faintly from the direction of the farmhouse. The Wyoming sky held everything in its enormous blue indifference, which was, in its way, a kind of comfort, the reminder that the land endures, that the work endures, that the things we build with honesty and care outlast the crises that forced us to build them. Frank and Helen Malone rode home together in the morning light, side by side, the way they had ridden every good morning since the season that had proven everything worth proving, on the land that had given them the reason to prove it. The gate of the Malone ranch closed behind them with the specific sound of a home receiving its people. Everything was well. Everything was whole. Everything was exactly as it was always meant to be.